Thanks for coming back this week for this week's Bible study. I've been trying to upload the New Testament videos, but I had a problem with YouTube causing me problems with the upload, and I will post here what I got in the morning. So I'm attempting that again this week, so just bear with me as I try to get those videos up. But I know that censorship is a really bad thing right now for us Christians, and there are people that don't want the word to get out. And there's entities and businesses that don't want the word out because they know that the word is the magic in your life. I want to show you that this is the Bible that I use when I study. I also have a study Bible, and this is the one that I like to color in, and I like to write in, and I write a lot of sticky notes, and I color some things in there. So this is the King James Bible that I love. It's nice and flexible. They have different covers for this. And if you want to find out what are the items that I use for my Bible study, you can go down below to the description box. I have an Amazon favorite store with a lot of RV stuff and some other things there as well. But I also have a place where you can see all of my Bible study favorites as well. So let's get into the word today. We are in chapter 8. I'm so excited because this chapter was so fascinating to me. I had read it before, but unless I really get to studying the chapter and understanding the times and what was going on and what of these weird things that you read about, but a lot of us pass those weird things by and we don't really understand what they mean. And there's a lot of weird things in chapter 8. So we're going to go and read them and understand them today. That's what's going to make it so exciting for all of us. So let's get into the word. All right. So before we start chapter 8, I just want to talk to you a little bit about Matthew. And in the book of Matthew, we've been learning a lot of things about Jesus that he's been teaching us. But I also want to talk about the importance about Matthew, because he was a tax collector. I talked about this in my video 1 of the New Testament, all the information about Matthew. But at this point now, he is a disciple of Jesus, as we know, and he's recording all of this information. But I also want you to understand that this was a man who was a professional. This was his job. He was despised by many people because he was a tax collector. But also notice that when Jesus told him to walk with him, he was really leaving his employment. He was leaving his job. See, he was different than the other disciples because the other disciples were fishermen. So if it didn't work out for them, they didn't have nothing to lose. They can just go fish anywhere, right, and make a living. But for Matthew, it was different because he was a professional and he didn't really know how he's going to fit in to what Jesus had for him. But Jesus had a plan for him, right? So for Matthew, his life totally changed. Remember, he was despised, and now he was actually accepted by all of these people that he was hanging around with. So this change must have been something really wonderful for him and fulfilling for him to have these people around him all the time, right? And accepting him. And not only that, but also he was given skills that none of the other disciples could have done, because he had a specific way of recording the details and all of the things that he saw that Jesus did and said and all that he taught. So this was really important because this is why we're reading this today, because of these special skills and the purpose that God had for Matthew, where he didn't think he would fit in, but obviously he was of a great importance, the skills that he had to bring all of this to those people and to the future generations. Remember that you have to trust God with your skills and your abilities, and understand that he made each of us capable to follow him. And if God tells you to be a servant, it doesn't mean you're going to be a fisherman. It doesn't mean you're going to be a tax collector. You can have like the kind of abilities where God will find a placement for you in this world where you can serve him, or maybe it's serving a church or serving a ministry or something like that, where you can serve the body of Christ. So remember, all of us have those skills, and we need to allow God to guide us in the direction for a purpose for us. All right, let's get into chapter 8 of Matthew. We're going to start with verse number 1. When he came down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him. Now remember, we are still reading from Sermon of the Mount. This is where Jesus gave a lot of teachings over there. And when he came down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him. Reading from my notes, the miracle of Jesus was going to attract a lot of attention. And because he was really very different from most of the scribes at the time. So Matthew's comparison of the events that he records is going to be different than when you read Mark and Luke. Because Matthew in this part here, he's recording according to the topics. And in the book of Mark and Luke, they are recording things according to the chronological events. And that's the difference in the stories here. Let's go to verse number 2. And behold, there came a leper and worshipped him, saying, Lord, if thou wilt, thou canst make me clean. So let's talk a lot about this leprosy, because I know we've talked about it in the Old Testament where we were reading some of the chapters in there. But let's understand it for some people who haven't read the Old Testament. So leprosy was really like AIDS back in the day, kind of like what we have now is AIDS. So it was a really terrible disease and there was no cure for it. Some diseases were similar to leprosy, but some forms were actually contagious, and that's what people feared the most, and that's why you were put out, and we'll read more about that now. So the leprosy is going to start. This is how bad it was. I mean, I didn't know. I was reading and researching, and I was like, wow, this stuff was really bad. I mean, this was like a curse on you if you got leprosy. So the leprosy, it might start with a loss of sensation in some part of the body, and in the nerves were also affected. And the muscles would eventually waste away, and the tendons sometimes would contract until the hands became like claws. Like you could be walking around with your hands stiff like that. I mean, really, can you live like you can't eat, you can't do anything with stuff like that? The feet would also get like the hands like stiff. And then it says here that you would also progress into losing at some point your fingers and your toes. And also you can lose your hand or your foot. It would just like drop off. And this progression in your leprosy to the point of where you're losing these body parts, it could take from 20 to 30 years. It was like a slow death. It was really horrible. This is the importance that we have to know this, because there was a lot of concern over leprosy back in the day. So according to the Jewish law, in the customs, you had to keep at least 6 feet away from a leper. And if the wind was blowing from a leper, they had to keep 150 feet away. The only other thing that was worse than coming in contact with a leper was actually coming in contact with a dead body. So this was also considered that you were defiled. You were not allowed to touch. That's back in Leviticus. These are things that you had to be ceremoniously cleaned when you came and touched a dead body. So the leper was considered the same kind of thing. If you contracted this contagious type of leprosy, then a priest would declare the person a leper, and banish him from his home and from the city. So the leper was sent to live in a community with other lepers until he got better or he died. So you can imagine how terrible this is. You have to leave your family, your loved ones, to go be with sick people, and you're watching these feet falling off. And it's just a horrible life and a situation. And the reason I'm bringing this is because you will get to know in a few minutes the story and what the importance of the story is coming up. So that's why we have to know these things. So also religious people, especially rabbis, they scorned the lepers and they despised them because they saw them as people under the special judgment of God, and they were not deserving of any type of pity or mercy. These were the religious folks. And that time, it wasn't uncommon that rabbis would boast about how badly they treated lepers, and some of them even bragged that they wouldn't buy a leper that was a beggar in the street, they wouldn't buy them food. Or they would even boast about throwing rocks at them when they saw them on the street. That was the kind of religious people that we had back then. Now you can see why Jesus really came down on these religious people, because that was just plain mean, right? So verse number 2 that we just read, it says that the leper came. So realize this, now that we know the information about the atrocities towards the lepers, right? And the things that they have to go through. I mean, think about, this is like a life of rejection. This is like almost living in hell here on earth. So think about this. He didn't have anybody to take him to Jesus, and he never physically had an example of what Jesus can do. So he obviously just heard it, because if he's living in this community and the word is getting around, this leper saw a chance to get healed, right? So he didn't actually see Jesus do healings. He heard about it. So that's what made him come all the way there. And remember, he is standing there in front of all these people who are going to judge him, right? Who are going to look at him. He's coming out of the community. And he still came out with the hope that Jesus would heal him, but he didn't have a certainty that Jesus would do it, right? So that was an act of faith, him coming out and going through all of this turmoil in order for him to be healed. He didn't have an invitation from Jesus, so he was probably also feeling ashamed, and he probably felt alone in the crowd, because he's not going to be allowed to be standing around the other people. He is going to be out all by himself. And guess what? I'm sure that Jesus, from all of the crowd that was there, Jesus chose him. Jesus saw him. Jesus saw his need. His eye probably went straight to this man. But he still came despite all of these problems, and he was in such a desperate condition. He worshiped Jesus. He didn't beg Jesus, but he worshiped him, because by coming to him, he honored him as the one who could meet his need. He honored Jesus with that. That is an impossible, miraculous healing that you are about to witness. This is the first miraculous healing that you are going to see here in the New Testament. Well, obviously, we are thinking that because the word here is saying that the leper worshiped him, we're also going to picture that this man not just walked in faith and came to Jesus, but he also could have bowed or kneeled before Jesus. And that was why it said here that he worshiped Jesus. He also called him Lord. And by doing that, he was honoring him as the master and God that he worshiped him. And he worshiped him with humility and not demanding, but leaving the request up to Jesus. He was worshiping Jesus with the confidence that Jesus was the only one that could make him healthy and clean. And he rendered Christ's divinity and paid homage to it. That's how strongly he felt. Now remember, all of the other healings before this have been, simple type of healing. There is nothing that has been done like this. This was an immense faith that this had man, that this kind of a disease Jesus can heal. Obviously, the leper had no doubt that Jesus' ability could heal him. But his only question here in number 2 is, will Jesus do it? Is he willing to do it for him? Because he already believed in Jesus' power. He knew, he had faith to know that Jesus could do it. But the fact was Jesus going to do it for him? Now remember that this leper came to Jesus by himself, despite all the discouragement in his life that he's witnessed, especially from these rabbis, there was probably rabbis there. So Jesus was willing to reach out and touch the leper when he asked to be healed. This lesson is kind of a model for us to realize that sin affects us by corrupting us. It pushes God away from us, and it's almost like we're living, but we're dead. That's what this story represents here, okay? And what he's doing when he heals the leper is he's bringing him from death. The same thing he does for us when we confess our sins and we repent, right? So that's kind of like where the story is coming from here. It also tells us that sin is a curable disease. So even if you have sinned really bad, you can still come to God if your heart is willing to do that. The other part of the story that we have to understand, that he came to Jesus just like we can come to Jesus, and Jesus is the only one who can give us that healing. He can heal our physical body as well as he can heal our spiritual sense as well. And by doing this, he can restore us back to God in fellowship with God. Just like the leper, you have to be willing to recognize that it's not about you, it's about Jesus, that you are coming to Jesus and that you want to follow him because you believe in his ways. And that is what's going to bring you back to the fellowship with God. And this is how he's going to restore your life, just like he's doing here for the leper. So let's read on. Let's go to number 3 here. Oh, before I go on to number 3, I just wanted you to know also that the leper, he just didn't want to be healed. He also wanted to be cleansed. If you look in the end of chapter of the verse number 2, he said he wanted to be clean. So remember that the effects of this disease also affected his life and his soul, and he wanted cleansing of all of that shame and guilt and pain that he's endured over his life. That was going to be a residue within him. So he just didn't want the physical healing. He also wanted the cleansing from inside, you know. So that's really powerful because only Jesus can do something like that for us. Verse number 3, and Jesus put forth his hand and touched him, saying, I will, be thou clean. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. So not only was he healed, he was also spiritually cleansed. So it must have been like a new life for this man, and he felt brand new, reborn, revived. This was really a compassionate touch from Jesus. And remember that the leper was probably keeping his distance from Jesus, but Jesus still reached out and put his hand and touched him. He reached out to him. Now in ceremonial law, you shouldn't touch a leper. That was what it was. So this was even more meaningful because Jesus went ahead and did that. And even the law didn't allow this. Jesus didn't have to touch him, but he touched him because it was important. It was an important testimony that he had the witnesses there to see how miraculous this healing was going to be for this man. It was almost like reviving him. He was bringing him back almost from death. Can you imagine something like that? In the book of Mark, it also mentions that Jesus was moved to compassion for this leper. So imagine this leper seeing Jesus, this powerful man, this healer, this person he had faith with, actually looking at him with compassion. That must have done something for him inside. That must have awakened this incredible love for him as well. And I'm sure that at the moment that he saw that, there was even more love for Jesus at that moment. So you can, if you start picturing this in your mind, you can see how important all of this was and how Matthew used his recollecting of these facts to let us know what was going on here. Because we read it last week in Matthew 7, verse 7, Jesus tells us that we should ask and it will be given. And this is a perfect example of what he just taught us in 7, right? Now let's go to verse number 4. And Jesus saith unto him, See thou tell no man, but go thy way, shew thyself to the priests, and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a testimony unto them. Jesus was telling him to be quiet about this miraculous healing and about the work that he had done, because he really didn't want the excitement of the crowds until the proper time for his revelation of the prophecy in Daniel 9. So he didn't really want it to be a big deal out of it. Remember, it wasn't about him making himself famous. It wasn't about becoming a celebrity through his testimony. It was about his ministry. And he wanted to demonstrate the power that he had as the Messiah. And that was what his purpose was, right? And that he also wanted to show that he loved and cared for the people. and that he was humbled. He didn't want misunderstandings of the true nature of his mission, that people would talk and make up stories. And later in Mark, it tells us that the leper obeyed Jesus because he went out and began to proclaim the works of Jesus. So that's basically what we are called to do as well. If Jesus changes your life, then it's your job to go out and tell people what changed. Why did your life change, right? Not everybody is out there to do a ministry or be a public speaker or write books or anything like that. If we all tell the truth about why our lives changed and how it became better, that's part of the mission that we might have with God, right? And that's exactly what the leper did. All he did was tell people how his life changed and what Jesus did for him. It says here that he was supposed to go to the priest, the leper, and tell them. So according to Leviticus 14, it was a priest that was required to examine a healed leper. And Jesus wanted this man to give his story to the priest to prove that his leprosy was completely gone so that he can be restored to the community. And Jesus was following the law. Jesus never told us to not follow the law. He was still following the law, and he wanted this man to do as the law said. Because in the Mosaic law, there was a prescribed specific sacrifice that had to be conducted when a leper was healed. So this is why this man had to report it, and the ceremony had to be performed, and it was rarely ever performed because nobody really was healed of this sickness. So if you go to Leviticus 14, it will tell you what the ceremonial requirement was for this. As you can see, Jesus was still following the Old Testament law. Verse number 5, and when Jesus was entered into Capernaum, there came unto him a centurion beseeching him. A centurion is also known as a Roman officer who was a career military officer in the Roman army, and he would control hundreds of Roman soldiers, and he was usually hated by the Jews because of their oppression, control, and ridicule. So this man's genuine faith would amaze Jesus because he was going to be a hated Gentile, right? And he was going to actually put to shame the pompous Jewish leaders by coming to Jesus. This is how big this event is right here. In the Geneva Bible, it also states that this was obviously an uncircumcised person, and it would make the religious people jealous because the prophecy was being fulfilled about the Gentiles going to heaven. Now, this was a Gentile. This was a Roman soldier coming to a Jew for healing. Prophecy is going to come to pass. That was noted in the Old Testament. So the officer could have allowed pride, doubt, money, language, distance, time, self-sufficient power, and race to stand between him and Jesus. But he still didn't. And he didn't let those things affect him one bit. He still came to Jesus. And we're going to see in the next verses how important all of this is, because it's going to get interesting from here on in. Also, I want you to note that when Jesus came into Capernaum in Matthew 4:13, it is mentioned that this is where Jesus lived. So he's returning back to where he was living. In this verse number 5, where he uses the word beseeching in the King James Bible, we also have to note that this was not a casual request of the soldier. This was actually pleading. He came pleading to Jesus. Verse number 6, and saying, Lord, my servant lieth at home, sick of the palsy, grievously tormented. This is important to note that this soldier had an unusual attitude toward his slave, because back in Roman law, a master had the right to kill his slave, and it was expected if the slave became ill or injured to the point where he could no longer work, then they could just kill the slave, right? But this is something very different here. Verse number 7, and Jesus saith unto him, I will come and heal him. It was the Jewish custom that a Jew shouldn't enter a Gentile's house, right? But Jesus didn't hesitate to go to the centurion's house. And that's what we're reading here. Verse number 8. The centurion answered and said, Lord, I am not worthy that thou shouldest come under my roof, but speak the word only, and my servant shall be healed. Here, the soldier was supposing that this great rabbi and teacher like Jesus wouldn't consider his home worthy, because most Jews believed that the homes of Gentiles were not worthy for them. They thought of themselves superior, right? The soldier was also showing consideration of Jesus's time and his trouble of travel. So he was demonstrating that he wasn't a self-centered person when he was talking to Jesus about this. Here, the soldier also, where he said, but speak the word only. So when the soldier is telling him that he could just speak the word, the soldier is recognizing that Jesus had the healing power, but this wasn't some magic trick that required a magician's presence. He knew that Jesus had the authority and could command things to be done and completed outside his immediate presence. So he could have called the healing from where he was. He realized that. Verse number 9, for I am a man under authority, having soldiers under me. And I say to this man, go, and he goeth. And to another, come, and he cometh. And to my servant, do this, and he doeth it. Verse number 10, when Jesus heard it, he marveled and said to them that followed, verily I say unto you, I have not found so great faith, no, not in Israel. This man basically was demonstrating his faith, and by having the confidence in Jesus, and he was really praising him because he knew how much power Jesus had. He was demonstrating that to him by his word. Here, even though the word Israel is mentioned here, there really wasn't an Israel by this time. There was only the covenant people, but it wasn't going to matter because the Gentiles were going to be able to enter the kingdom of God. Verse number 11, and I say unto you that many shall come from the east and the west, and shall sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. So in the other verse, he was talking, Jesus had referred to the Jews as Israel, but there really wasn't an Israel at this point. It was just a covenant people. And that's what he's referring to now, that the Gentile people from the east and the west were going to come and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, because now Gentiles were going to have the opportunity to also enter the kingdom of heaven. A lot of Jews didn't like the fact that the Gentiles were also going to be entering in the kingdom of heaven. And we get that because in Isaiah 25 verse 6, and also in 55 and in 66, 12 and 19, it was part of the prophecy of the Messiah, and people knew that, especially the religious leaders. They knew that that was what the Messiah was coming for. They knew about this universal theme that was coming, but the Jewish leaders, they really chose to ignore it. It's showing us that you can accept, or you can accept, or you can reject the goodness of Christ. And that's what a lot of these religious people did. What Jesus is telling us here is you can't go into the kingdom of God, right, if you think that your heritage is going to get you in, like the religious leaders were thinking. They thought that just because they were Jewish and they belonged to a certain race of people, that they were automatically going to get into the kingdom of God. That's not the case. That's not what the Messiah came for. Okay, you had a choice to make. You had to follow Jesus, and you couldn't get in there because of your parents or anything like that, or any customs or laws or anything. You had to make the choice yourself, and we have to make those choices ourselves even today. It hasn't changed. And this part here where they talk about the outer darkness in the Geneva Bible, it makes reference that the children of God have this light, right? And when they don't make the right choices, they're actually going to be cast off into the darkness. And that's what this is referring to here in 12. That's why you have to make the choice to go to the kingdom of God. It doesn't come from custom or laws. You have to make the choice. And even if you have the light and you were born into it, you still have to walk in its ways, right? You can't turn. Just because you were baptized as a baby and now you turn from God, that doesn't mean you're going to the kingdom of heaven, right? Verse number 13, and Jesus said unto the centurion, go thy way, and as thou hast believed, so be it done unto thee. And his servant was healed in the self same hour. Verse number 14, and when Jesus was come into Peter's house, he saw his wife's mother laid and sick of a fever. I'm really enjoying a lot of these things because as I started learning, I start to see that it's so in depth in a lot of these verses when you really get down to studying them. So here clearly it's telling us that Peter was married. And in the Roman church, it teaches us that priests should be celibate and not married. Peter was actually going to be like one of the greatest first popes, and he was married. So I don't know where they get all of this rules and stuff from. Now we're talking about Peter's mother-in-law, who Peter was waiting for Jesus and his disciples, and she had the faith to wait for Jesus. She was also waiting for Jesus, so she had the faith as well. It wasn't just Peter. Verse number 15, and he touched her hand, and the fever left her. She arose and ministered unto them. Understand from this verse, because it was just a simple fever, right? It wasn't something drastic as the healing of the leper, but we can learn from this verse that any little small thing, when we call on Jesus, he hears us and he's willing to save us from that, right? That's what we have to take from that verse. Additionally, it also shows us that once she was healed, she got up and started serving him. That's how grateful she was for what Jesus did for her. So she immediately was restored to a spiritual health where she could serve Jesus. Verse number 16, when the even was come, they brought unto him many that were possessed with devils. And he cast out the spirits with his word and healed all that were sick. All right, let's talk about this because some churches really refuse to talk about demons and spirits and all of that. But in the New Testament, you're going to see that Jesus dealt with this a lot. And this is not the first time in chapter 8 that we're going to hear about this stuff. So remember now, for my notes I wrote that they belonged to a nation that was wicked. And because of this, they were strongly attracted and addicted to magic. And this was the reason that they had these evil spirits, because through this magic that they were seeking, right, in their pagan world, they were also getting infected with these evil spirits. And that's what happens when you guys go looking for Ouija boards and tarot cards and all of this evil stuff. This is what you're bringing into your life, is these evil spirits, and you're bringing them into your home, and you're bringing it into your home to your children as well. So now here, it's where it says that he healed all that were sick. Matthew is showing us Jesus's nature, right? Through a single touch, he healed people. And when he spoke one word, the evil spirits would leave the people, because Jesus had the authority over the evil powers and all of earthly disease. And that's what we're learning from this verse here. Verse number 17. That it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, himself took our infirmities and bare our sickness. This is letting us know that Jesus didn't have a magic bag of healing power, and that he had to endure a lot and suffer a lot to save us. And that's what's going to come up, because that's what the prophets told us what's going to happen. That's what Matthew here was referring to, the prophecy of Isaiah 53, which refers to spiritual healing, but also includes the physical healing, and how the Messiah was going to be delivering the people from the bondages of sin and the effects of the fallen world. And that's where you're going to be reading that there. Verse number 18, and now when Jesus saw great multitudes about him, he gave commandments to depart unto the other side. At this point, Jesus's popularity was increasing, kept more on the private side, and he actually avoided the people around him. But there was probably a lot of great noise. There was probably people wanting to do this. They wanted to be disciples. They wanted to be like him. And he just had to make sure that he was focused. He was a man who was focused on his mission, and he wasn't there to be affected by popularity. Verse number 19, and a certain scribe came and said unto him, Master, I will follow thee wheresoever thou goest. Verse number 20, and Jesus said unto him, the foxes have holes, and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man hath not where to lay his head. It's not to crush this guy, but Jesus is very truthful when he tells people things. He's telling this man, you really can't follow me, because he wasn't going to glamorize his life for this guy, right? He wanted him to know the truth of what it was really like. The nature of his mission would eventually keep him traveling, right? And it would keep this guy on the move. He wouldn't be able to be with his family. So this wasn't a glamorous life. And it didn't mean that he was penniless, but it did mean that he was homeless. And Jesus often stayed at Peter's house because, Peter never turned him down. And the life that he was leading was really a very simple life. And he had faith, trusting his Father in heaven was going to meet every need. And he never reserved resources. He didn't save resources. He just lived his life really simply ministering to the people. And many people were not going to be able to do that. And he was just honest with them. For my notes, I also wrote that the term here, the Son of Man, is mentioned 81 times in the gospel. When they're referring to the Son of Man, they're either referring to Jesus as that, or that Jesus calls himself that when it's mentioned. Now, he uses it to reflect on the glory and the humility of the Messiah. And both of these, you will find them reflected in Daniel 7, verse 13 to 14, and in Psalms 8:4. Basically, Jesus was telling him here that he just didn't have a place to call home. And he's also telling this guy that this life was not going to be comfortable or easy. It was going to come at a great cost, at a sacrifice. And you're not going to have earthly rewards or security. That being a disciple of Christ is really an investment. And it's really about your eternity and how it's going to reward you in the end. So it's really not going to be a reward of what you're going to see in the world at the time. This was a difficult time for these kind of things to be happening. There was going to be a lot of revolt and things like that, as we know it's going to happen. 21, and another of his disciples said unto him, Lord, suffer me first to go and bury my father. This is another disciple. So these weren't the original disciples. This was just another disciple. That these were people that were learning, right? Jesus was teaching them. So it was possible that this disciple wasn't asking for permission to go to his father's funeral, but he was putting off following Jesus until his elderly father died, because he wasn't asking to dig a grave for a deceased father, but he wanted to remain in his father's house and care for him until the father died. So this could have really been something that was indefinite. And this could drag on for a while. This guy wanted to follow Jesus, and he knew that it was good to do so, but at the same time, he had a good reason of why he couldn't do it. And it's important for us to know this, because he might have been a firstborn son and wanted to make sure to claim his inheritance, or he didn't want to face his father's wrath if he left the family business to follow a preacher. So this guy's concern could have been more for financial security or his family's approval, or it could have been for something else, and he just didn't want to commit himself to Jesus. But yet Jesus doesn't accept the guy's excuse either. Jesus was really very direct with this guy who wanted to follow him, and he made sure that he counted the cost and set aside any conditions they may have for following him, and he demanded loyalty. he didn't hesitate to question him. He said that even someone's family loyalty was not to take priority over obedience to him, right? This shows us that God, once you come to Jesus, you are going to have enemies. Sometimes your friends are going to turn on you, even your own family members. And you have to remember that you have to put Jesus ahead of that. Because if they're not willing to accept the fact that you are walking with Jesus now, sometimes you really have to separate from your family, right? And that's what Jesus is demonstrating here. And God many times will do that, where he wants to remove people, including family members, from your life, because they're going to be keeping you from your purpose, and you just have to separate from them. Another thing that happens to us when we come to Jesus is also we might have to leave our jobs, because once we know better, we realize that we might be in jobs that are compromising us and our integrity, and we really have to leave from those places. So we have to trust at that time that God is leading us towards a new life, right? And you can't really walk in a new life if you're continuing in the old. And if you know in your heart that you're in the wrong place, then you really have to walk with faith and realize that God is leading you to do something new. Verse number 22, but Jesus said unto him, follow me and let the dead bury their dead. So Jesus was clearly telling the man that no obligation was to be put up ahead of following Jesus, and that Jesus had to come first in the ministry, right? So Jesus wasn't afraid to discourage potential disciples. He was really more interested in the quality than in the quantity of disciples. And Jesus really was being honest and telling them exactly what it would take to follow him. And he wanted the people to know this right up front from the beginning. It wasn't going to be an easy life. Verse 23, and when he was entered into a ship, his disciples followed him in. The ancient historian Josephus, he wrote that there were usually more than 300 fishing boats in the Sea of Galilee at one time. And this was an unusual body of water. It was small. It was about 13 miles long and 7 miles wide, but it was 150 feet deep. And the shoreline was about 680 feet below sea level. And because of this, sudden storms could appear over the surrounding mountains with little warning, where it stirs the waters into violent 20-foot waves. They didn't really know this was happening. They actually got caught without warning. And then they felt their danger was great during this time. Now, the disciples were probably really familiar with this type of boat. And it was pretty large because it was able to hold Jesus and the 12 disciples. And it was always powered by the oars and the sails. But during the storm, the sails were taken down to keep from ripping and making the boat easier to control. So that was probably something that they ended up doing when the storm came suddenly. They probably removed the sails. Verse 24, and behold, there arose a great tempest in the sea, insomuch that the ship was covered with the waves, but he was asleep. So this is referencing to the true nature of Jesus and his humanity, right? That he became tired because he had an intense life, and that he was living in a constant strain on his body and his mind, and that he would have to catch sleep wherever he could. And sometimes he would do it in unlikely places. And that's why he didn't glamorize, and he told people up front what it was like to be in this ministry. We also need to realize that he could really sleep peacefully because he was totally trusting the love of his Father. And this is why he was able to sleep in a storm, because he was totally trusting of everything. For his whole life, he was trusting of God. Verse 25, and his disciples came to him and awoke him, saying, Lord, save us, we perish. For my notes, I wrote that even though the disciples had witnessed many miracles, they still were panicking in the storm. And they were expert sailors, and they knew the dangers of these storms like this. But they didn't know that Jesus could control the forces of nature. And this is what we're going to look to here, because this is the first time that they're going to see something as miraculous as what happens. In the story, you have to consider that many of us will eventually encounter storms in our life where we feel that God can't or won't help us. But what we truly have to understand is that God controls the storms and also the storms of our hearts. And when you ask Jesus to calm the storms, he will deal with us with those problems that we face. And all we have to do is ask him into our heart and never feel that his power is less during our trials of life. So that is a great lesson for us to learn about this. 26, and he saith unto them, why are ye fearful, O ye of little faith? Then he arose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. From my notes, I wrote that you should take notice that Jesus did not rebuke them. He rebuked their fear and their unbelief, not their request because of waking him up. He wasn't upset at that. What he was really upset at was their fear and how fear and unbelief go together, and that's why he didn't like that. Really, when you trust God fully, there shouldn't be any room left for fear, is what the lesson teaches us here. He didn't stop the wind at first. He spoke to the men first. So even all of this is going on, you would think that he would have jumped up and cast off this problem. He didn't. He ministered to them first. Especially because they had just seen the miracles that were done with the leper and all the other things that were going on. He had already shown them his power. He had shown them his authority. They had seen great faith from others towards him. They had Jesus on the boat with him who was in peace. And they should have had peace as well, but they didn't. They were faltering, right? So in this verse also, when it says that he was rebuking the winds and the sea, means that he didn't just quiet the wind and the sea. This is telling us that this fear that the disciples had also could have been because they sensed that there was a spiritual attack within the storm as well. Now, this could have been an attack by Satan because now he had all of the preachers of the gospel with Jesus in one place and in this one vessel, and he wanted to defeat the purpose of God and to prevent the salvation of the world, right? So that could have been an attack that was laid upon them. So that's why Jesus rebuked the wind. Verse 27, but the men marveled, saying, what manner of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him? So from my notes, I wrote that the disciples were so amazed over Jesus's display of power over the creation, and they knew that Jehovah was the only one that had the power and authority. So in a few moments, they were able to see the humanity of Jesus and then the fullness of his deity and his calling, right? And they saw that he was truly man, but he was also God. Verse 28, and when he was come to the other side into the country of the Gergesenes, there met him two possessed with devils, coming out of the tombs, exceeding fierce, so that no man might pass by that way. Here in this region, which is located southeast of the Sea of Galilee, near the town of Gadara, and this was one of the most important cities of the region at the time. Gadara was a member of the 10 towns that had independent governments and were largely inhabited by the Gentiles. And if you look at Mark verse 5:20, you will know more about it. When we get to Mark, we'll learn about those things. So for my notes, I wrote that these towns had independent governments and they were largely inhabited by the Gentiles. And this is going to explain the herd of pigs coming up, because the Jews didn't raise the pigs because pigs were considered unclean and they were unfit to eat. In the book of Matthew, it says that there were 2 demon-possessed men, but in the book of Mark and Luke, they both refer to one only. And it's apparent that Mark and Luke were mentioning only the man who did the talking. The other one didn't do the talking. That's why only one was mentioned in those books. So these demon-possessed people are usually under the control of one or more demons, and these demons are fallen angels who joined Satan in his rebellion against God, and now are evil spirits under Satan's control. They help Satan tempt people to sin, and they have a great destructive power. But whenever they are controlled by Jesus, they lose their power. So these demons recognize Jesus is the Son of God. They didn't feel that they needed to obey him. So you see that just believing in God is really not enough, right? Because faith is more than just belief. By faith, you're going to accept what Jesus has done for you. That's why it's important for you to go to Jesus. It's not just knowing God. You also have to believe in the blood and the sacrifice and what Jesus did for us. And when you receive him as the one and only who can save you from sin and live out your faith, you have to obey his commands, right? So these men were known to be unclean because of their contact with the dead, and they displayed uncontrollable behavior. And that's why the demons drove them to live among the tombs. And this was terribly offensive to the Jewish people, because for Jewish people, it was like, you cannot touch a dead person. This wasn't a proper place for men to live. It made them more frightening to the others. And it also encouraged superstition and to others that these men were possessed with the spirits of the dead from the graveyard. When I read this, I think about a lot of people who are praying and practicing and playing around with things like that, where they like going to graveyards, or when Halloween comes, they like worshiping graveyards. And if you're a Christian and you're putting things up like that, that's a form of worship. When you're decorating your house, the blessings that God has given you with graveyards and wicked things like that, you really have to think twice about those things. Remember that all of these things, when you're putting them out there, they come with evil spirits. And you're also bringing those into your home where your children are, right? Verse number 29, and behold, they cried out, saying, what have we to do with thee, Jesus, thou Son of God? Art thou come hither to torment us before the time? So according to the Jewish ceremonial laws, these men that Jesus encountered were unclean in 3 ways. Number 1, they were Gentiles, they were demon-possessed, and they lived in a cemetery, but Jesus helped them anyway, showing us that we should not turn our backs on people who are unclean, or those who are repulsive, or who violate our moral standards and religious beliefs. Instead, we have to realize that every human individual is a unique creation of God, needing to be touched with Jesus' love. But remember, they have to want that as well. 29, and behold, they cried out, saying, what have we to do with thee, Jesus, thou Son of God? Art thou come hither to torment us before the time? In Revelations 20:10, it tells us that at the end of the world, the devil and his angels will be thrown into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur. So when these demons asked Jesus if he had to come to torture them before God's appointed time, they showed him that they knew their ultimate fate. For my notes, I wrote that evil spirits always want to be left alone to do the dirty work. And these demons wanted to do as much damage as they could before their time of the destiny of their torment. Verse number 30, and there was a good way off from them an herd of many swine feeding. Verse 31, so the devils besought him, saying, if thou cast us out, suffer us to go away into the herd of swine. From my notes, I wrote that because the Jews and the Gentiles both populated the region of Galilee, this could have been a herd of pigs owned by the Gentiles, but because they were known to be unclean to the Jews, these pigs should have really not been there. Notice here that the demons couldn't inflict the pigs without the permission of God. Devils have no power, but if you're a sinner and you are cast away from God, then the devil has control over you. Verse 32, and he said unto them, go. And when they were come out, they went into the herd of swine, and behold, the whole herd of swine ran violently down a steep place into the sea and perished in the waters. All right, so for my notes, I wrote that the demons wanted to enter the pigs because evil spirits are fixated on distraction and they hate to be idle. So they're always working to do evil. When the demons entered the pigs, they drove the animals into the sea. So their actions proved their destructive intent was to destroy the men, and now they would destroy the pigs. You can see that Jesus values human life. It says here that nothing else in the Bible compares to the casting out of demons from a human into animals like it did in this Matthew. But Jesus allowed this because Jesus wanted us to know the real intention of these demons and how they wanted to destroy the man just as he destroyed the pigs. And because these men were made in the image of God, they could not have their way as easily with the men because their intention was just the same, to kill and destroy. Verse 33, and they that kept them fled and went their ways into the city and told everything and what was befallen to the possessed of the devils. So for my notes, I wrote that Jesus, knowing human nature, knew what to expect from this crowd coming from the city, but his disciples thought that these people would be excited that Jesus delivered these demon-possessed men, because the work of Jesus was to unify the whole city, and they all came out to talk with him, but it wasn't in a good way. So the people from this region really were not happy that these two demon-possessed men were delivered. They were really more interested in the pigs than the people. And this was also an explanation as to why the demons wanted to go inside the pigs, because this would cause hatred and rejection to be stirred up against Jesus, because the demons drove the swine to distraction, hoping to blame Jesus, and then he would be unwelcome there. These were pigs that were lost from their property owners, and who knows also if the people were watching and they wanted to take the pigs for themselves, and now this is like money. So they wanted to take the pigs for themselves, and Jesus had done this, and now they didn't have an opportunity to take the pigs, right? So they were looking at them as possessions and not really being appreciative for the act of what was done here. Verse 34, and behold, the whole city came out to meet Jesus, and when he saw him, they besought him that he would depart out of their coast. What the people did was they asked Jesus to leave, because unlike their own pagan god, Jesus couldn't be contained. He couldn't be controlled or appeased. And they feared Jesus' supernatural power, which they had never witnessed before. And they were upset about losing the herd of pigs more than they were glad about the deliverance of the demon-possessed men. This lesson we should learn that we shouldn't be valuing possessions and investments and animals above human life. In the Geneva Bible, I thought it was nice that they said here that where men live as swine, there Christ does not abide with demons. So we're going to end it at that today. Next week, we're going to get to chapter 9, where Jesus heals a paralyzed man. He eats with sinners. He heals a bleeding woman, restores a girl's life. He heals the blind. And then he urges the disciples to pray for workers. So these chapters, usually I read 2 chapters a week, but this is just so chock full of teachings that we ourselves have to learn and understand, and they're important because this is what Jesus wants. So if you are the person that wants Jesus into your life, don't you want to understand who this Jesus is, what he came for, what he taught, and who he was? Of course we do. So that's why we have to make sure that we understand who he is and what he wants for our life as well, so that when we come to him, we come with a clean heart, really being heartfelt for what he wants for us in our lives, and that we understand fully who he was, what he came to do, and what he did for us, and that we value that and accept it into our heart and rejoice in the opportunity that we have to start our life over. So with that, I thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful week. God bless all of you. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.